June 6, 1944, 05:30 a.m., Normandy. General Alfred Jodl laughed when he learned that the British had cancelled their air patrols. No one would attack with this weather, he said. At the same time, German bunkers along the Atlantic Wall were confidently silent. The sky was closed, the sea was raging, and the belief was unanimous. No enemy would dare to cross the English Channel under such conditions. That confidence, however, was about to disintegrate. Not under bombardment, but under tons of steel, fuel supplies, and soldiers landing non-stop. What the Germans called an impregnable fortress would, in practice, be crushed by an equation they refused to calculate. Production at scale, logistical supremacy, and total dominance of the air. D-Day, seen from the German perspective, was not just a defeat. It was the moment when the war proved unrecognizable. This documentary presents the invasion of Normandy not from the perspective of the liberators, but through the eyes of those who expected it with superiority and ended up buried by statistics. A confrontation between tactical faith and industrial strength. It was the day when German courage discovered that you cannot fight the ocean with machine guns. But before we dive into the accounts, there is one statistic that defines this story better than any witness. In just one day, the American side mobilized more than 6,900 vessels, 14,674 aircraft, and landed more than 15,000 tons of supplies on the beaches of Normandy. On the other side, radios went silent, tanks stopped without fuel, and generals watched the scene without connection between their own commands. What the Germans called the Atlantic Wall was, in effect, a barrage of sand against a logistical tsunami. The invasion they believed they could contain with machine guns was organized as a production line. If you value historical accuracy and want to see how the war went from being won by bravery to being decided by spreadsheets, leave your like, subscribe, and help us keep alive the memory of the facts behind the propaganda. The Atlantic Wall was not just a defense system, it was a promise. From Hitler to the last private, the narrative was clear. No army would cross those shores. With its 17 million cubic meters of concrete, 6.5 million mines, and more than 10,000 points of resistance between bunkers, pillboxes, cannons, obstacles, and trenches, it has been heralded as the most formidable defensive structure in modern military history. Advertisements showed proud soldiers watching the sea from inside fortresses carved in stone and steel. German engineering, according to the Third Reich, had built a wall capable of stopping even the tide. But this wall, imposing in appearance, hid weaknesses that were not visible in the posters or in the speeches. The biggest one was not in the cement, but in the empty warehouses. The construction of the wall consumed tons of resources at a time when Germany was already suffering from severe raw material constraints. Many positions were erected in a hurry and without standard. The projects varied according to the region, the command, and the materials available. In practice, what was supposed to be a uniform system of interdiction has turned into a defensive patchwork. In key sectors such as Omaha and Gold Beach, there was a concentration of positions, but in other entire stretches of the French coast, the defenses consisted only of sharp logs pointing out to sea. The reports of the Todt organization, responsible for the construction, record that dozens of critical points were never completed. In many places, the guns were out of ammunition stocked. In others, there was even a lack of trained personnel. The doctrine that guided the fortification was that of psychological deterrence, a visible fortress that projected fear, even if it was not technically ready. And at that point, it worked. It was believed in Berlin that no Allied general would dare to attack it head-on. The bet was that the visual threat would force the Allies into riskier attempts, such as air jumps into the French countryside or landings from the south. That was the illusion, that the Allies would see and retreat. But what Hitler didn't see was the factory. In 1944, the United States alone produced 96,000 airplanes a year. Germany, just over 35,000. The Americans manufactured a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. It took Germany weeks to deliver a single Heinkel. In tanks, the disparity was even more brutal. For every Panzer IV delivered to the Wehrmacht, the Allies landed 3 Shermans. In ships, the difference was abysmal. While the Germans struggled to replace sunken vessels in the Mediterranean, the Americans launched new Liberty ships in less than 5 days. By the time the Atlantic Wall was completed, American industry had already built up enough strength to bypass it. Here's a fact ignored by German generals. In terms of munitions production, the U.S. outpaced Germany by 10 times. That's right, 10 times as many bullets, projectiles, grenades, and explosives ready for use. If this number surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened. While German engineers buried mines in the sand, Americans filled ships with spare parts, fuel, ration, and equipment for a months-long war. The illusion of the wall dwelt on the belief that the enemy would be like the previous one, limited by distance, time, and supplies. But the Allies were no longer constrained by borders. They created a direct line between the factories of Detroit and the beaches of Normandy. This line could not be bombed. It was constant. It was redundant. It was inevitable. And the German defenders only realized this when they heard the engines of the vessels crossing the fog, when they saw that the first destroyed tanks were immediately replaced, when they noticed that for each obstacle there was a machine designed exactly to overcome it. The resistance was heroic, but heroism alone against the scale of resources was statistically irrelevant. The wall stood with pride, but it broke, not because it was weak, but because what came against it was not just an army, it was an entire industrial system in motion. And when the first skydivers started falling out of the sky, radar operators still believed it was more of a simulation. In the bunkers, soldiers cleaned weapons without knowing that they were hours away from facing the largest amphibious assault in history. In the next part, we will see how the belief in the impossible caused the German generals to literally leave the front, and how the weather forecast became the first Allied weapon that morning. On the afternoon of June 5, 1944, as Allied engineers placed the last explosives in the floating ports and naval convoys crossed the English Channel under closed skies, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel embarked for Germany. His destination, Ulm, where he would celebrate his wife's birthday with a pair of gray suede shoes recently purchased in Paris. He left the front convinced that the invasion would not happen before the storm was over. Other commanders followed the same reasoning. General Friedrich Dollmann, at the head of the 7th Army, released his officers for war games in Rennes. Naval patrols were suspended. Rear troops returned to routine. The reason for this confidence? A weather report. Walter Stumpf, a meteorologist for the Luftwaffe, had assured that the weather would remain impractical for at least 2 more weeks. And since Germany had no weather stations in the North Atlantic, destroyed or inaccessible since 1941, it based its forecasts on fragmentary data collected by submarines and coastal posts. What the Nazi High Command ignored is that the Allies had privileged access to measurement systems in Greenland, Iceland, and Canada, as well as aircraft that flew over the Atlantic to accurately map weather windows. That's how Captain James Stagg, chief meteorologist for Supreme Allied Command, identified a short 36-hour climatic truce, enough to cross the channel and land before the weather took a turn for the worse again. Eisenhower trusted the prediction. Hitler did not. The difference between the two wasn't just strategic, it was technical. While one side used airplanes and computers to predict the unseen, the other relied on backward maps and the instinct of veteran officers. This was the first technological victory of D-Day, turning the weather into a weapon. Rommel's absence from the front, coupled with the dispersion of the generals and the slowness of the German command system, which required Hitler's personal authorization for the use of Panzer divisions, paralyzed any immediate response. At 11:15 p.m. on the 5th, Freya and Würzburg radars along the Norman coast began to detect large air formations coming from the north. Reports have been sent, but what the officers received in return were generic orders to monitor and await confirmation. The Germans were accustomed to false alarms. In the previous months, the British had created multiple disinformation operations, dropping paratrooper dummies, radar reflecting balloons, and even fake transmissions that simulated the traffic of non-existent troops. The High Command became skeptical, blinded by its own sophistication. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, would later write that the hesitation of that night was the price of institutional arrogance. We thought we knew how to read the war, but we were reading signs of the past, while the new war had already begun. At midnight, real paratroopers began to fall. Still, the order from headquarters was clear. Do not move until the situation is clarified. This wait lasted for hours, and it cost entire positions. Germany had structured its defense under the doctrine of centralized control. Local initiative was viewed with suspicion. In times of calm, this offered discipline. In times of invasion, it was suicide. Major Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, requested clearance to attack as soon as he received reports of paratroopers around. His request was stuck between echelons, waiting for signatures that would never arrive. At dawn, he wrote in his diary, "The war for us ended the moment we hesitated." The contrast between Allied tactical mobility and German doctrinal rigidity became explicit. D-Day wasn't just a turf battle, it was a collision between two ways of thinking. On the one hand, a coalition that accepted risk, decentralized decisions, and adapted technology to the field. On the other, a military machine accustomed to absolute command, hierarchical rigidity, and the myth of invincibility. The German general's choice to relax that night was more than an operational error. It was the natural consequence of a doctrine that believed that war could still be won with human predictions and structural certainties. But none of this would resist what came from the sea. At 05:00 a.m. on June 6th, the radars stopped picking up aircraft. The silence lasted a few minutes. After that, metallic echoes from naval engines appeared, and the French coast witnessed the largest concentration of vessels in human history. This was the true confirmation that the invasion had begun. But at that moment, the generals were still too far away to see, and the German response, when it finally arrived, would be born too late. In the next part, we'll see how this hesitation turned into desperation when the first paratroopers began to fall at unexpected points, and how the enemy confused the German command by using soldiers who didn't even exist. At 0:30 on June 6th, chaos fell from the skies, and it wasn't fully human. At dozens of points in Normandy, paratroopers descended in silence, without firing a single shot. Some seemed motionless, others exploded when they touched the ground. On their bodies, lights flashed, fireworks simulated gunfire, and automatic radios transmitted false commands. They were mannequins. Operation Titanic, coordinated by the British Special Air Service and the 1st Allied Army, scattered hundreds of straw-stuffed canvas figures throughout the French countryside, with the sole aim of causing alarm. In parallel, Operation Glimmer simulated vessels on radar, and Operation Mandrel blocked communications. For the average German soldier, what happened was a multiple invasion. For the Nazi command, it was a puzzle with no reliable pieces. Contradictory reports began to pop up at command posts, crashes to the east and west, troop movements in unlikely places, engine noises where there were no runways. The troops on the ground, already conditioned to distrust their own communication, were paralyzed. Units prepared to face ghosts. Entire troops were moved to non-existent flanks. The 12th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, for example, remained stationed for 3 hours awaiting confirmation of a supposed mass landing south of Caen, which never occurred. The greatest asset of the German armed forces, its centralized command structure, became that morning its greatest obstacle. No decision was made without superior validation, no initiative was encouraged without visual confirmation, and ironically, this is exactly what the Allies had predicted. The electronic and psychological warfare launched that night did not seek to defeat the enemy by force. She sought to freeze her logic. The dummies, nicknamed Ruperts, were joined by small units of actual saboteurs, few in number but decisive in impact. They attacked ammunition depots, roads, and telephone cables. The illusion turned to panic. In several parts of Normandy, German soldiers fired into the shadows. In Carentan, one detachment reported shooting down 3 paratroopers with bright eyes. These were mannequins with reflectors. At another point, near Saint-Lô, an entire patrol retreated after finding a dozen figures standing in a field, all motionless. None of them were alive. General Wilhelm Falle, commander of the German 91st Airborne Division, was killed shortly after 01 hours while returning from a conference. His convoy fell into an actual ambush by American paratroopers, but his death symbolized what was happening to the entire German command. He was not in the right place at the right time, and he did not know where the enemy really was. In all, 23 German divisions went on high alert in the first 3 hours of D-Day. The others were mobilized to contain illusory threats. Doubt had won over certainty, and while commanders waited for the situation to clear up, the actual paratroopers of the U.S., 2nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were already operating behind the lines, destroying bridges, confusing communications, and cutting off strategic lanes. The genius of the operation was not in the number of soldiers involved, but in the multiplier effect. A dozen planes carrying dummies caused more hesitation than an entire division in formation. Allied superiority so far was not measured in casualties caused, but in delayed German decisions. In the early hours of the morning, the Allies rewrote the logic of the invasion. They would not win by blockading, but by making the enemy fight. This was the new form of warfare, where false data, lights, radios, and dummies could change the fate of entire divisions. General Hans Speidel would write in his memoirs that never before had such a well-trained commando been so blind, and he added, "The first wave was not made up of soldiers, was made of uncertainties." Meanwhile, the real naval landings were approaching, and when the first ships appeared on the horizon, the Germans would still be looking up at the sky, trying to understand what was real. In the next part, we will see the exact moment when the fog cleared and the German observers saw for the first time what was coming. Not an army but a fleet that covered the sea from horizon to horizon. At 05:15 in the morning, the fog over the English Channel began to dissipate. What was revealed behind the gray curtain was not just a fleet. It was a vision that no German war manual had prepared. The horizon, from one side to the other, was completely covered by boats. Warships, destroyers, freighters, troop transports, landing craft, barges, dredges, ferries, mobile pontoons. In all, 6,939 boats, organized with mathematical precision, moved in sync towards the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled in any war, at any time. In the bunker of WN-62, the radio operator hesitated for seconds before transmitting. He didn't know how to describe what he saw. "It's as if the sea is covered in steel," he recorded. Artillery officer Bernhard Ferking, stationed in the same sector, summed up the psychological impact of the scene with a single sentence spoken to his men. "The whole world is coming," and for those who were there, that was exactly the feeling. An organized, disciplined world, fed by a production machine that knew no shortage. The coastal defense doctrine of the Third Reich did not foresee such magnitude. Hitler had invested millions in concrete, mines, and cannons to prevent tactical landings. But what was approaching was not a landing, it was a transplant of the continent. The Allies had industrialized the war. Each ship was a logistical module. Each barge carried not only men but complete support systems. Ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, radios, tools. They didn't just come to attack, they came to stay. Oberleutnant Heinz Kübler, in charge of a coastal position in Vierville-sur-Mer, would describe after his breathing failed. It was not a fleet, it was a floating carpet, and there was no end. On the German side, the effect was devastating. In the first few minutes, even before the first shot, the tactical and moral superiority evaporated. Soldiers trained to repel attacks by sectors now observed a tide of steel advancing over all points simultaneously. Coastal artillery tried to identify priority targets, but there were no priorities. Everything was a threat. While each German shell was measured, counted, and allocated with Spartan accuracy, the Allies fired en masse. Behind the scenes of this scene, American logistics was already working on another scale. Each ship approaching the coast was replaced by 3 others in the rear. With each destroyer that fired, there were dozens ready to take its place. It was a war without pauses. No logistical break. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but there was no way to face it. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed behind-the-scenes content of the war that propaganda hid. At 05:35, the first salvo of naval bombardment opened fire. The battleship USS Texas fired 255 14-inch shells at the tip of Pointe du Hoc in just 34 minutes. To the south, the Royal Navy's HMS Warspite fired timed bursts at the defenses at Sword Beach. The official records of the Naval Heritage Command confirm, in the first 90 minutes of D-Day, more than 2,000 tons of explosives were dropped against German positions. The impact was not only structural, it was symbolic. Many bunkers designed to withstand the heavier bombardments began to crack. Some were simply torn from the ground, and while the concrete was breaking, the belief in the invincibility of the Atlantic Wall was also beginning to crumble. In post-war interviews, several soldiers reported the same physical phenomenon: involuntary tremors, dizziness, disorientation. It wasn't the fear of death, it was the fear of irrelevance. German doctrine had always believed in efficiency, but now, in the face of the overwhelming scale of Allied production, efficiency seemed like a superstition. And yet, the ships had not yet stopped. They were still arriving. General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, would receive the most difficult report of his career at 06:00 hours. The entire coast is under attack. The Armada has no end. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when the first shots came from the ships, and how Allied naval bombardment not only destroyed positions but buried the idea that courage and concrete could stop an assembly line. At 5:35 a.m., the sea roared, but it wasn't the sound of the waves. It was the beginning of the heaviest naval bombardment in the history of modern warfare. The first shot came from HMS Warspite, opening fire on the Sword Beach batteries. Within seconds, the entire line of Allied ships turned into a floating wall of fire. The USS Texas, the Nevada, the Arkansas, the Glasgow, the Ajax, the Arethusa, all firing in sequence, like an orchestra synchronized by the clock of industry. Every minute, dozens of 14, 15, and 16-inch shells cut through the Norman sky, toward targets fixed with millimeter precision by spotters and reconnaissance planes, coastal batteries, bunkers, artillery, machine gun points, crossings, minefields. Nothing was spared. The Norman soil, soaked from the rain of the previous day, began to break up into slabs. The psychological impact was as overwhelming as the physical. The German soldiers sheltered in the bunkers describe in their memoirs a sense of paralysis. They did not know whether to shout orders or pray. The naval bombardment was not just an attack. It was a revelation. The concrete, which until then had been a symbol of safety, now vibrated, cracked, collapsed. What was supposed to withstand anything began to sink under the mathematics of steel. Bunker 72 near Pointe du Hoc, designed to withstand direct hits from aerial bombs, was destroyed by 2 consecutive shots from the USS Nevada. Its occupants died buried, without ever seeing the enemy. In Omaha, projectiles fell every 10 seconds on entire sectors. The dust and smoke made it impossible to see beyond a few meters. Communications were cut. Underground telephone lines, protected from infiltration, sabotage, and saboteurs, were crushed by the simple vibration of the gunfire. The radio antennas, camouflaged in the fields near the coastal positions, were torn from the ground by shockwaves. German artillery, mostly stationary, struggled to locate targets amid the smoke. By the time the ships approached, they had already fired and moved again. Coastal observers tried to calculate enemy positions based on sounds, echoes, and flashes, obsolete methods against a fleet that operated as an interconnected system. The German doctrine provided for punctual resistance, sectoral control, defensive precision. But now they faced something they could not measure. Colonel Ernst Goth, commander of the 916th Grenadier Regiment, calculated that his artillery could fire 120 rounds per minute in the event of a landing. It was a respectable estimate, but he ignored that. On the other side, the Allies had the firepower to fire up to 10 times more per minute, in a sustained way, for hours. The USS Nevada alone fired more than 300 14-inch shells on the morning of D-Day alone. The artillery crew used cranes to feed the guns. It was an industrial process aboard a warship. The logic was simple. If the target is not destroyed on the first shot, it will be on the 10th, and if it survives the 10th, the 15th is already on the way. At WN 60, one of Omaha's most heavily fortified positions, 3 bunkers were buried before the actual landing began. Men were buried alive. Others were buried, excavated by colleagues, and reburied minutes later. No doctrine prepared the human spirit for this cycle. The intensity of the bombardment broke not only structures, but convictions. A gunner in the 352nd Division wrote in his diary, later found by Allied forces, "We said the Americans were weak, but they are building victory with steel." This was the new battlefield, where every ship represented a factory, and every shot was part of an unbroken production line. And even with all this power, the ships were still on the move. The cycle was continuous. Ships fired, reloaded, switched positions, received new coordinates, and fired again. No position was secure, no routine was maintained. With each attempt at reorganization, a new wave of destruction erased any progress. And while German soldiers were trying to understand the pattern of firing, Allied destroyers were already adapting to new real-time information provided by aerial observers and reconnaissance troops. The advantage was no longer just numerical. Now it was digital, albeit analog. The Allied chain of command worked in sync with radars, maps, planes, and constant communication. On the German side, silence was beginning to become the rule. A radio operator from the 716th Division wrote years later, "We heard the sea, but we did not know where the attack was coming from. It was as if we were fighting against infinity." In the next part, we will see what was left of the Luftwaffe in this scenario, and why. Faced with 14,000 Allied aircraft, the German Air Force was only able to make a single symbolic attack on the morning of the landing. Air superiority, once fervently promised by Reich strategists, had evaporated under the crushing weight of industrial reality. As more than 14,000 Allied sorties tore through the Normandy skies between heavy bombers, escort fighters, observation planes, and transport gliders, the Luftwaffe could barely take off. Of the hundreds of squadrons that made up the German Air Force at its peak, only shadows remained, operating on rationed fuel, young and inexperienced pilots, and poorly maintained aircraft. On the morning of D-Day, only 319 German sorties were recorded. Most of them did not even reach the combat zone. Those that did were quickly repelled or neutralized by an Allied air cover so dense that it practically sealed the sky. At 6:30 a.m., and when the first American soldiers set foot in Omaha, only 2 German planes carried out an attack on the beaches. 2. They were Focke-Wulf F-190A-8 fighters piloted by Lieutenant Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman, Sergeant Heinz Wodarczyk. Armed with machine guns and rockets, they plunged over Sword Beach in a swift pass, fired a token burst, and immediately retreated, pursued by multiple Allied fighters. The action, recorded in the Allied and German war diaries, became a symbol of the Reich's air collapse. Meanwhile, the skies were saturated with C-47 aircraft, B-26 bombers, P-51 fighters, P-47s, and Spitfires. The synchrony of the British, Canadian, and American Air Forces allowed for a steady rotation of missions: tactical bombing, traffic interdiction, close air support, photographic reconnaissance, and electronic warfare. It was an air operation that didn't just follow the invasion, it led it. Each artillery detected was eliminated within minutes. Every attempt to move along secondary roads was intercepted by fighter bombers in formation. Every 90 seconds, an Allied plane flew over the front. The Luftwaffe, which had humiliated France in 1940, was now facing the technical collapse of its structure. Without air superiority, the Blitzkrieg doctrine no longer worked. The reinforcement convoys could not move in daylight. Every armored column that tried to reach the coast was obliterated by Allied squadrons armed with bombs, rockets, and machine guns. General Gunther Blumentritt, then serving in Army Group B, would later record in his memoirs, "We could not move a single division without the sky breathing fire." Germany still had planes, but it didn't have experienced pilots, not enough fuel, and no spare parts to scale. By 1944, American industry was producing more than 7,000 airplanes a month. Germany did not reach 1,000. While Ford manufactured a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, German factories saw their production lines bombed daily. The Luftwaffe struggled with what was left, and what was left were the bones of a giant. Driver Kurt Booligan, an ace with more than 100 confirmed victories, described the moment he noticed the change. "They came in waves. We couldn't even take off safely. And when we flew, it was to be hunted, not to hunt." The practical result was brutal. 90% of German positions on land were totally unprotected against air attacks. There was no cover, there was no interception, there was no rescue. Air superiority, which was supposed to be a precondition for any counteroffensive, had become an obsolete fantasy. While the propaganda still promised the arrival of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, the reality showed planes crashing due to lack of parts and pilots using bicycles to reach the bases. The irony of the situation was palpable among the soldiers themselves. A commander of the 352nd Division reportedly told his men on June 7th, "Don't look up, there is only the enemy there." And it was true. Out of every 100 aircraft in the Norman sky, 99 were Allied. This complete dominance transformed the land campaign. With the Luftwaffe out of action, the Allies had complete freedom to run their logistical operations. Gliders landed accurately, supply columns traversed newly liberated fields, and each advance was preceded by coordinated aerial bombardment. The absence of contestation in the skies allowed the Allied engineers to begin, in the first days, the construction of the artificial ports of Mulberry. In a matter of days, they were unloading tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, and soldiers directly on the shore. It was the engineering miracle driven by the mastery of the air. The Luftwaffe had promised to cut off the invasion of the beaches. What he delivered was silence. British historian Anthony Beevor summed up this point clearly. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in Normandy. It just wasn't there anymore. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when the Allied troops finally stepped into the sand, and how the German artillery, even as a brave fight, was faced with ruthless math. For every Nazi machine gun, there were dozens of ships, hundreds of soldiers, and the entire sky behind them. Bunker WN-62, perched high on the cliff above Omaha Beach, was one of the best armed positions on the Norman coast. There, top scorer Heinrich Soe was in position from the first hours. When the bombardment curtain ceased for seconds and the fog revealed the first LCVPs tearing through the waves toward the sand, he and his companions opened fire. The MG-42 spewed bursts at 1,200 rounds per minute, and even with deadly precision, the effect seemed nil. For every American soldier who fell, another 5 emerged from the ramps. When the first row toppled over, the second was already in the water, and behind her, the third. Around the bunker, the ground shook with the impact of the naval shells still echoing off the flanks. The field of vision was blurred by the smoke and the raised sand, but the sound left no doubt. They kept coming. Heinrich changed the barrel of the machine gun twice in the first few hours. The heat was so hot that the cartridges came out incandescent. Around it, more than 2,000 capsules formed a metallic carpet, and even so, the Americans went up. The WN-62 position, designed to withstand localized attacks, had never been tested against an offensive that combined aerial bombardment, naval bombardment, amphibious landing, and full air cover, simultaneously. When one of his colleagues tried to fire a mortar, the ammunition did not explode. It was too wet from the condensation of the night before. Radios did not work. Neighboring positions, such as WN-61 and WN-63, had already been silenced by American battleships. From the German point of view, the struggle had become an isolated island of resistance in an ocean of enemies. Heinrich and his men kept firing on instinct. The doctrine taught, resist to the end, every second counts. But in that scenario, every second seemed useless. The math was relentless. In the first 12 hours of D-Day, the Allies landed more than 156,000 men, 1,500 armored vehicles, and more than 4,000 tons of supplies. In Omaha alone, where the resistance was most intense, more than 34,000 American troops touched the sand. The Germans, by contrast, had fewer than 2,000 men scattered among all the coastal positions in the sector. Many never reached the post. Others were out of ammunition or communication. The statistic that Nazi strategists had underestimated was brutal. For every American tank produced, the Reich could manufacture only 1.5. For every plane shot down by the Germans, the Allies produced another 15. With each day of landing, the Allied artificial ports moved more cargo than the entire French rail network captured by the Germans. If this comparison impresses you, comment below, shocking data, because that's exactly what German soldiers faced. A war where numbers, not just gunfire, defined who would win. In WN-62, the machine gun barrels began to warp. The accumulated heat deformed the steel. The sand mixed with the blood made the weapons difficult to handle. The Americans, even under intense fire, used the bodies of their comrades as cover. Doctors descended with stretchers still under gunfire. Allied radio operators continued to transmit coordinates, guiding the bombardment accurately. And from the sea, new vessels arrived every half hour. When Heinrich looked down the crosshairs for the last time, he saw that he was no longer facing a wave. It was facing a permanent tide. American losses were real and heavy. It is estimated that more than 2,400 soldiers died at Omaha that day. But the question was, what has this changed? Nothing, because Allied logistics had already predicted losses. There were already substitutes. There was already more ammunition, more supplies, more reinforcements. The sacrifice, no matter how high, was built into the plan. The Germans, on the other hand, had no second line. Every man lost was irreplaceable. Every machine gun destroyed was a strategic loss. The combat is no longer symmetrical. It became arithmetic. A formula was being fought. Late in the morning, Heinrich Soe was captured by troops of the 116th Infantry Regiment. He was covered in soot, dried blood, and sweat. His eyes showed no fear, but emptiness. In his makeshift cell, he reportedly told an American officer, "We shoot until the barrel breaks, but you didn't stop." In the next part, we will see how the floating ports, structures unthinkable by German doctrine, began to transform the beach into a logistics warehouse capable of sustaining an entire army for months, revealing that the real secret of victory was not in weapons, but on cargo ships. As the day wore on, the German commanders in the field found that real defeat would come not by guns, but by the arithmetic of collapse. Machine guns were still firing, anti-tank guns were still operational in some positions, but ammunition stocks were plummeting rapidly. German defensive doctrine called for punctual and staggered resistance, intense fighting, followed by reinforcements from the rear, but the rear no longer existed functionally. The tanks of the 21st Panzer Division, stationed at Caen, waited for orders that never came. The units of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, positioned to counterattack, were immobilized for lack of fuel. Several Panzer V's and Panther remained hidden in woods, unable to move. The supply chain was cut. Secondary roads had been bombed by Allied fighter bombers. Bridges destroyed by the French resistance. Trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel exploded before they even crossed 30 kilometers towards the coast. The Allies had anticipated each logistical axis and neutralized each connection point. The tactical operation became hour by hour, a structural strangulation. Meanwhile, Allied soldiers on the front lines received new shipments with each tide. Naval engineering had done the impossible. 2 floating ports, the famous mulberries, began to be assembled in less than 72 hours. Formed by floating platforms, moving docks, and vessels sunk on purpose to create breakwaters, the mulberries transformed beaches into makeshift deep-water harbors. This allowed that already on the second day after landing, more than 9,000 tons of supplies were unloaded per day. In a week, that number would jump to 20,000. The Germans were surrounded by logistics that were advancing faster than their troops, and each attempt to contain this advance clashed with the lack of inputs. Gunners were ordered to ration ammunition, only accurate shots. Each shot was preceded by calculations. The Americans, on the other hand, shot without savings. An Allied battalion consumed more ammunition in a day than a German division received in a week. The 352nd Infantry Division, tasked with defending Omaha, reported that there were no more replacement grenades by the end of the 6th. The armored vehicles stationed there had shells for only 2 short engagements. There were no plans for quick refueling. German doctrine, based on rapid offensive maneuvers, had never considered the hypothesis of a prolonged defensive war on occupied soil. When reality changed, the structure collapsed. The telephone cables were cut. Radio transmissions were chaotically interrupted by Allied electronic interference. Rare messages that reached the high command were fragmented, out of context, late. General Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, would write, "We received desperate requests, but every decision of ours was based on an outdated photograph. It was like trying to play chess on a moving board." In contrast, the Allies operated with integrated communication between sea, air, and land. Observers transmitted coordinates in real time. Troops called for airstrikes with meter accuracy. Engineering units mapped critical areas for logistical advancement and prioritized road construction and track recovery. The Americans didn't just land, they were building, in real time, a new war infrastructure on top of the ruin of occupied France. While the Allied columns advanced with trucks loaded with fuel, the Germans dismantled bicycles to try to improvise ammunition transport. In many sectors, the soldiers retreated not out of fear, but because of a lack of supplies. Some officers tried to improvise supplies by confiscating food from local villages, which only increased the civil unrest and strengthened French resistance. The Wehrmacht had ceased to be an army on the move. It became a collection of fixed positions, surrounded by an enemy that multiplied by the hour. In a report intercepted by the British Intelligence Service, a German officer states, "The only constant of the enemy is that he never stops coming." This was the silent siege, not by tactical sieges but by the inability to move. The numerical superiority was overwhelming, but it was the continuity of supply that sealed the fate. In certain areas of Normandy, the Americans had 3 grenades for every rifle. The Germans had 3 rifles for every grenade. When the fight became a statistic, there was no way to win it with courage. And what came next would be even more uncomfortable for Nazi doctrine, because the tanks that were beginning to arrive on the beach, brought by special ships and by pre-assembled roads, were not only numerous, they were easy to replace, to maintain, to refuel. In the next part, we will see how the Allies set up a war factory on the sand, while the Germans tried to fight with parts that no longer existed. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed northeast of Caen, was considered the Wehrmacht's main rapid response force throughout Normandy. Its armored vehicles, veterans from Africa and the Eastern Front, were seen as the movable wall against any invasion attempt. Clear German doctrine: should the enemy land, the panzers would advance in force, crushing the beachhead bridges before they could consolidate. But at dawn on June 6, 1944, when reports confirmed multiple landings on distinct sectors of the coast, the division remained static. For more than 8 hours, the German tanks were grounded, not for lack of fuel or parts, but for contradictory orders, lack of clarity, and fear of the unseen. The High Command in Paris demanded visual confirmations, while the chain of communication collapsed under interference and sabotage. The Luftwaffe, powerless in the air, could not guarantee recognition. Generals feared that the landings would be a distraction, a deception. Worse, the advance should take place under the direct authorization of Hitler, who at that time was still asleep, and whose assistants refused to wake him. Time ran out, as the Allied gliders fanned out behind the lines. The 21st Division, instead of marching to the front, was waiting for the release of a man absent from reality. When the order was finally given, around noon, chaos had already set in. The division's advance met with unexpected resistance, not in the form of tanks or artillery, but of unseen obstacles. Roads were blocked by craters, columns of French refugees complicated traffic, and, most crucially, entire units of Allied paratroopers had already taken strategic crossings. The 192nd Armored Infantry Regiment, spearhead of the counterattack, was met not by trenches but by minefields mapped out by Allied engineers. A commander reported that at every turn there was an ambush, a nest of machine guns that had emerged from where nothing had existed before. The gliders launched hours earlier had turned into makeshift fortresses. The division, designed to crush, now retreated, not knowing exactly where. In several sectors, German tanks encountered airborne resistance before they even sighted the sea. It was the total inversion of the doctrine. The armored vehicles were supposed to defend the coast, but they were pushed inside, reacting in panic. In a symbolic action, a battalion of the 21st managed to break through the line and reach the outskirts of Sword Beach. But when they saw the sea full of ships and the sky still dominated by Allied fighters, they retreated without engaging. A lieutenant in the division later wrote, "It wasn't a battlefield, it was an ocean of metal, and we were drops." The doctrine of the blitzkrieg, rapid movement, mass attack, surprise, was now in Allied hands. The Wehrmacht, which for years had imposed terror with tanks advancing at speed over Europe, now faced an enemy that operated with the same logic, but on an industrial scale. The Americans weren't just landing, they were already building internal routes, supply lines, and temporary depots as they went. The idea of an immediate counteroffensive, central to German strategy, was disintegrated by the speed of the enemy operation. And it wasn't just about physical speed, it was about speed of decision. While the Allied generals adapted their actions based on real-time reports, the Germans waited for authorizations that never came, or came too late. The 21st Panzer was not defeated in direct combat. It was swallowed up by the 20th century warfare structure that the Allies had perfected: decentralized command, on-demand logistics, integrated communication. In practice, each advancing American platoon had more tactical information than many German generals on D-Day. An officer of the German General Staff, reviewing the reports after the collapse of Normandy, wrote, "The war is no longer decided by divisions. It now belongs to the radio cables." And for the 21st Panzer Division, that phrase was literal. By the time he finally managed to retreat and regroup, the beach was already lost. The enemy had not only landed, he had already settled in with permanent structures. Bunkers combining sandbags, barbed wire, and field engineering began to appear at the rear of the beaches. Troops rested in tents with hot meals and medical attention, while American tanks descended from LST vessels, as if on a fixed dock. The German blitz had been surpassed by a blitz of another kind, not that of destruction but that of accelerated construction. In the next part, we will witness how the Allies built in a few days a supply system that would feed almost 2 million soldiers, and how the Germans, unable to break through the logistical encirclement, were condemned to watch a war that was no longer tactical, to become an arithmetic inevitability. On the morning of June 7th, the beaches of Normandy were no longer just a theater of combat. They were a war laboratory in operation, and at the center of this new experiment were machines that German doctrine never imagined it would face. When the 1st British armor of the 79th Sharpened Division began to advance, the reaction of the defenders was not just surprise, it was bewilderment. What emerged between the mist and the wreckage were not ordinary tanks. They were absurd-looking contraptions, adapted for specific tasks that would previously have required dozens of specialized soldiers. These vehicles were known among the Allies as the Funnies, the Hobart Funnies, a nickname that hid a brutal truth. They had been designed for a single purpose: to break any obstacle between infantry and advancement. Under the leadership of General Percy Hobart, a military engineer with eccentric ideas and unconventional vision, the 79th transformed itself into an arsenal of creativity applied to war. Flamethrower-modified Churchill tanks, known as crocodiles, spitted forward spewing columns of liquid fire up to 120 yards. Entire fortifications collapsed under the psychological impact. German soldiers would rather surrender than face what they considered a moving hell. Another model, the AVRE, carried a 290mm mortar capable of destroying bunkers with a single shot. But the Germans did not yet know that the worst would come from the flails. Sherman crab tanks, equipped with rotating chains that rotated ahead of the track, detonated anti-tank mines before any vehicles could be hit. The sight was surreal, tanks dancing among the fields, sparking and exploding like a choreographed orchestra. And then came the bridges, transported by vehicles known as the Ark and Bridge Layer. These movable structures allowed rivers and trenches to be traversed in minutes. What the Germans built in days, the Allies bypassed in hours. Engineering had become a weapon, and each obstacle a mere matter of time. The shock of the German soldiers was visible in the reports. Tanks with unknown weapons, machines that clean the ground, vehicles that cross rivers as if they were floating. An officer in the Wehrmacht's 726th Regiment reported, "The British don't just attack with men, but with ideas that walk on treadmills." The Germanic doctrine, based on tactical precision, superiority of maneuver, and resistance at key points, was not prepared for the brutal fluidity of Allied innovation. The battlefield was no longer linear. It was transformed in real time, adapted to the mission, shaped like clay. These machines had been conceived years earlier, many of them inspired by the failures of the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940. Hobart, expelled from the British Army for seeming too eccentric, had been personally rescued by Winston Churchill. The bet on his vision was now reaping fruits, and Germany, which relied on the technical superiority of its Panzer and Tiger tanks, found that the Allies had outmaneuvered the field of force and won in the realm of creativity. The funny ones were not a joke, they were an answer. More than that, they were multipliable. The American and British industry produced these variants quickly. While it took the Germans weeks to recover or retrofit an armored vehicle, the Allies modified hundreds with industrial efficiency. The standardization of chassis, such as the Sherman and Churchill, allowed for quick conversions. Allied logistics, combined with ingenuity, transformed every need on the battlefield into a factory project. Nothing was impossible. All it took was time, steel, and imagination. The result was an advance that ignored the classical fundamentals of defense. Mines, ditches, open fields, and trenches, everything was overcome by a specific machine. Tactics were being replaced by technique. German bravery, trained for resistance, now faced an enemy who operated like an engineer. There was no way to predict which machine would come next. And with each successful advance, the German front line shrank, not by retreat but by disbandment. Military historian Stephen Badsey would point out, decades later, that the real differentiator of D-Day was not the number of tanks, but the way they were conceived. Funnies were not created to destroy, but to free the land from barriers. The British and Canadian infantry following them advanced over cleared soil, with cover of fire and continuous engineering support. Each meter conquered was accompanied by a practical solution. It was war as an industrial process. And while the Germans were still waiting for reinforcements that didn't come, Allied tanks were already adapting roads, opening routes, and establishing communications with new waves of supply. A German soldier captured on the Bénouville Bridge would confess, "We didn't know they could build a war. We thought they only knew how to fight." In the next part, we will see how this ability to adapt culminated in something even more unthinkable for the Germans: the construction of 2 entire ports, assembled in a few days, which would allow them to supply an entire continent from a beach. In the quiet darkness of the early morning hours of June 6th, While German generals were still debating whether the attack on the coast was real or a hoax, another kind of war had already begun, and it was being waged right in the heart of the German rear. It was a war without a front line, without defined barracks, without visible flags. Operation Overlord didn't just start on the beaches. It started in the skies, with thousands of silhouettes leaping in the pitch, touching the Normandy soil with the precision of a steel clock. More than 13,000 paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Divisions, as well as the British 6th Airborne Division, were dropped. But it wasn't just light infantry. These men were the common thread of an industrial-scale guerrilla war. The psychological impact was immediate. Entire villages woke up to the sound of gunfire coming from unseen spots. Former country roads, once safe, have become corridors of ambushes. The Germans were accustomed to fighting on set fronts, with maps, artillery, and aerial reconnaissance. But now the enemy was in the fields, inside the barns, camouflaged in the woods. Each shadow could be a patrol. Each French child an informant. The result? Paralysis. Entire German units stopped moving for fear of the unknown. The order was to wait for confirmation, check the route, avoid ambushes. But time, that one, moved on. And with it, the Allies. The paratroopers had specific missions: to seize bridges, blow up lines of communication, prevent reinforcements, and sow confusion. But the most devastating side effect was the feeling of ubiquity. The Germans did not know how many had jumped, where they were coming from, or where they were going. In the sector of the 91st Luftwaffe Division, the reports contradicted each other. Sometimes they claimed that the area was safe, sometimes that there were 5,000 American soldiers in the forest. Troops shot at each other overnight, confusing silhouettes, uniforms, and movements. Captured officers described the feeling as fighting ghosts. And then came the German miscalculation. They believed that the paratroopers had been thrown out of position, a logistical failure. But what seemed like mistakes were part of the engineering of chaos. By jumping scattered, the paratroopers increased the illusion of an even greater number of troops. At dozens of points, the Germans overestimated the enemy forces and decided to retreat or call for reinforcements that never arrived. The radios were silenced, the cables cut. The most critical intersections were already under American domination before the sun rose. German logistics, already weakened, now had to operate in a maze of disinformation. Supply trucks have become easy targets. Tanks were trapped between sabotaged bridges and improvised mines. The road leading reinforcements to the Utah Beach sector was blocked by a half-dozen soldiers from the 101st, using downed trees and mines glued to abandoned cars. And the British 6th, operating to the east, took the Pegasus Bridge in a lightning attack that it would take the Germans 2 days to comprehend. With each new hour, the reports that reached the command in St. Lo were more desperate. One of them said, "The enemy is everywhere, but we couldn't find him." What Germany saw as a smaller, light, and vulnerable force turned into a network of panic multipliers. The paratroopers didn't just fight, they changed the enemy's behavior. And while the Germans hesitated, the Allies landed by the thousands. Here is a pause, and a statistical finding ignored by Berlin. The United States produced 52,000 combat gliders between 1942 and 1945. The Reich, just over 4,000. The ability to transport troops, supplies, and light weaponry directly to the enemy rear was deeply unbalanced. If this difference surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because on the Normandy battlefield, winning is no longer a matter of fire superiority. It's now a matter of presence at multiple points simultaneously. By the dawn of D-Day, German troops were where they were because they could no longer move. And they could not move because the sky had been transformed into a vector of asymmetric warfare. The airborne forces did not win battles in isolation, but they prevented the enemy from organizing any counterattack. The very notion of the line of defense has been eroded. In the Heesville Woods, a group of 10 Americans from the 82nd held, for 8 hours, a column of 30 German soldiers with ambush tactics and sporadic gunfire. The result: the Germans believed they were surrounded by a much larger force. They did not advance. The battlefield has become a psychological game. Every noise could be an ambush. Every intact bridge could be armed with explosives. Each farm, an improvised base. Confidence in the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority evaporated, minute by minute. How to fight against an enemy that did not follow standards, that it didn't need lines, that he created new lines with each jump. In the next part, we will understand how the German nightmare took on even crueler contours, when Allied ships not only unloaded troops, but began to set up floating ports, structures so colossal that they seemed like a strategic joke until they started working. On the afternoon of June 6, 1944, as the landings intensified and the beaches were already saturated with Allied divisions, another collapse, invisible, silent, and devastating, was taking place behind the scenes of the war, the collapse of German communication. For an army shaped by hierarchy, rigid doctrine, and centralized control, the loss of contact with its units was tantamount to the loss of one's own military identity, and that's exactly what happened. The telephone lines connecting bunkers, barracks, and sector commands were cut with millimeter precision by saboteurs of the French resistance, guided by information from the Allied intelligence networks. At the same time, RAF and USAAF fighter interdiction bombers and fighters systematically destroyed communication centers, relay stations, and signal vehicles. In little more than 6 hours, the German army in Normandy went from being a coordinated machine to becoming a collection of isolated groups, reacting blindly. In practice, the Western High Command, led by Gerd von Rundstedt, began to operate in an informational vacuum. Messages that used to take minutes now take hours when they arrived. Leading units, such as the 352nd Infantry Regiment stationed at Omaha, faced massive attacks without being able to report their actual situation. What the generals received were fragments, rumors of landings, contradictory warnings, old orders trying to command a battlefield that had already changed shape. In Berlin, the situation was even more comical and tragic. Hitler was informed of the landings hours later, and his first reaction was to believe that it was a distraction. It was not the first. Several officers still bet that the real attack would come through Calais, and that what they were seeing in Normandy was just a deception operation. But what they did not know, and could not know due to the absence of data, is that the largest military operation in history was already in full swing, and they had missed the window to answer. German doctrine, so effective at the beginning of the war, depended on synchrony. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support were to operate as a closed system, orchestrated by informed decisions. But on D-Day, that system was forcibly opened, and the wires that connected it were torn out one by one. In contrast, the Allied system operated in a different logic: decentralization with redundancy. Each platoon commander was free to adapt decisions. Each unit had multiple communication channels. If one line fell, another was activated. Allied radios operated on secure frequencies, exchanging orders with encryption based on the Sig-Sally machine, proof of German interception. The Germans, with already compromised codes and obsolete devices, spoke into the void. Allied supremacy in communications was so absolute that, in some sectors, American tanks communicated with British infantry and Canadian fighters in real time, coordinating advances, airstrikes, and naval bombardments with surgical precision. Meanwhile, on German soil, an artillery battery commander reported, "I fired without knowing where. There was no map. I didn't know where ours were. I fired to where I heard gunshots." Combat ceased to be a battle for territory and became a battle for information. And the Germans were blind. The final blow came from the very nature of modern warfare: electronics. Allied electronic warfare equipment, installed on ships and aircraft, jammed German signals with deliberate interference. Entire stations were mute, unable to coordinate even a request for reinforcement. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. The country that had led the way in technological advancement in the 1930s now couldn't even care about its own soldiers. Radio silence became so absolute that, in many cases, the field commanders themselves went to nearby posts in person to report the situation, a desperate and slow effort that, on the battlefield of the 20th century, cost lives every minute. A striking example came from the 716th Infantry Division. Realizing that she was being enveloped in multiple sectors by Canadian troops, her commander attempted to request heavy artillery to stem the advance. But the campaign radio did not work. The telephone lines had been destroyed, and the messengers sent were captured or killed in the open field. Isolated, with reduced ammunition and without support, he ordered the withdrawal, not by strategy, but because he could no longer command. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating not because of a lack of discipline, but because it could no longer be disciplined. And this emptiness was felt even in the largest ranks. Von Rundstedt, at his headquarters, wrote in his diary on the evening of the 6th, "I command no more. I just observe." The short phrase sums up the operational bankruptcy of an entire army. The strength of a military machine based on order collapsed due to the absence of a single element: the signal, the command cry, the voice on the radio, confirmation from above. Without it, even the most faithful soldier fights in the dark and dies in silence. In the next part, we'll dive into the direct consequence of this failure: the Allies' construction, within days, of 2 gigantic floating ports, structures that seemed impossible but which would give the invaders something the Germans never imagined seeing on a beach: the ability to supply an entire war as if they were at home. While the Germans were still waiting for an air counterattack that would never come, or a sea retreat that was never contemplated, the Allies were building something even more decisive and more unbelievable. The beach, the Germans thought, was a temporary site. No invading force, they believed, could maintain an efficient supply line without a deep harbor. Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Calais, these would be the logistical keys to the invasion if it were to be prolonged. What they didn't anticipate was that the Allies weren't expecting to capture ports. They were bringing their own. Less than 96 hours after the first steps on French soil, one of the most audacious and secret projects of the Second World War began to take shape: the artificial Mulberry ports. Planned in secret since 1943, the Mulberry ports were conceived as floating modular systems, capable of being assembled directly on conquered beaches. The concept was simple and colossally ambitious: to send to the coasts of Normandy all the port infrastructure in floating sections, towed by cargo ships and destroyers, and to assemble them under bombardment and under the incredulous gaze of the enemy. What seemed absurd to German doctrine, to build a port on the sea, was to Allied logic just another engineering problem. And like all the others until then, it was solved with method, steel, and mass production. Mulberry A, positioned at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B, laid down at Arromanches, were composed of hundreds of components: floating docks, concrete breakwaters, known as Phoenix, ships sunk strategically to form barriers, called gooseberries, mobile platforms, spuds, and floating roads, whales. Each part had been prefabricated in England, numbered, tested, stored, and prepared to be assembled like a gigantic logistical puzzle. In less than a week, Arromanches began receiving convoys of full ships. Each vessel unloaded men, tanks, ammunition, and fuel as if it were in Liverpool. The strategic effect was immediate. The Germans, expecting an invasion that would wear out from lack of supply, now observed something unprecedented: the logistics of industry being deployed directly on the battlefield. A convoy of trucks disembarked every 3 minutes. Sherman tanks rolled straight from the barges to French soil. Fuel barrels were transported by pipelines mounted underwater. Fighter planes received maintenance and fuel directly from the rear, built on sand. The line between invasion and occupation had been blurred. The Allies were creating a new port where there had previously been only beach, and doing so with British precision and American scale. The comparison with German logistical capacity has become brutal. In 1944, Germany was already suffering from shortages of trains, fuel, and spare parts. The bombed cities, the routes sabotaged by the resistance, and the priority given to the Eastern Front made each division sent to the West a logistical sacrifice. The Allies, by contrast, were landing more supplies per day in Normandy than the Germans could move by rail in a week. At one point during the month of June, more than 9,000 tons per day crossed the Mulberry ports. For comparison, the port of Cherbourg, the original logistical objective of the Germans, had a capacity of about 6,000 tons per day. Allied engineering outmaneuvered even targets that the enemy considered strategic. With each new day, the ships lined up like on a production line. Civilian and military workers unloaded tanks, guns, and ammunition alongside mobile cranes, floating cranes, and makeshift roads mounted on pontoons. The Normandy coast was turning into a war yard. It was as if Detroit and Birmingham had been brought to France. A phrase jotted down by a captured German officer sums up the shock. They didn't come to attack, they came to build. And it was precisely this construction that sealed the fate of the German resistance. Without the need to capture a functional port, The Allies eliminated the time factor from the equation. The logistical timer started to turn in his favor. Every minute the Wehrmacht hesitated, a new company was landed. Every hour without an effective counterattack, a new column of tanks was lined up and supplied. The war now obeyed the logic of a production conveyor belt. The front line moved with the advance of the ports, and the ports moved forward with the ships. Even when a storm destroyed part of Mulberry, Allied response capability was so rapid that landings in other sectors made up for the loss. And once again, engineering showed its superiority. Spare parts were ready, reserve barges were activated, and the logistics line continued unabated. It was the war treated as a supply chain. A mistake? Fixed in hours. A flaw? Anticipated with redundancy. The doctrine of German improvisation, which had worked so well at the beginning of the war, now collided with a structure that did not need to improvise, only repeat, like a factory that never closes. And here is a number that escapes the common imagination. In just 3 months after D-Day, the Allied artificial ports had moved more than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. This was no longer an invasion. It was a military installation in motion, a floating industrial base, a project that transformed the beach into a rearguard. If this number surprises you, comment below. Absolute power, because it was no longer a question of how to fight. It was a question of how much you could carry, and the Allies were winning even that. In the next part, we'll dive into the German response, or the lack thereof. With trapped divisions, scarce supplies, and outdated tactics, what was left for the army that once set the pace of the war? The answer would come in the ruins of the Blitzkrieg myth itself. While the beaches of Normandy were transformed into war assembly lines, German reinforcements remained trapped, not out of fear, but out of impossibility. The legendary Das Reich Division, one of the Waffen-SS's most feared armored units, departed from southern France shortly after the first reports of the landing. The mission was clear: advance as quickly as possible, crush the Allied flank, and restore the line of defense. But the advance that was supposed to take 2 or 3 days with the speed and precision of the Blitzkrieg doctrine extended for almost 3 weeks, 17 days, and not through the fault of the troops. World War II for the Germans had turned into a race with broken feet. Every train carrying soldiers was targeted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters and British Mosquitoes. Each bridge was destroyed before it was reached. Each road hid explosives from the French resistance. Mobile warfare, a German specialty, had been stalled before it even began. The situation bordered on the surreal. A Das Reich reconnaissance platoon reported being ambushed 7 times on the same 15-kilometer stretch. At several points, soldiers had to abandon vehicles and continue on foot, under constant fire from enemy planes that patrolled the sky day and night. German tactics, designed for great advances in open fields, now encountered a maze of sabotage and punctual attacks. There was no clear front, no defined battlefield. It was as if France itself had become hostile to its former occupier, and indeed, it had become. The French resistance, strengthened and coordinated by radios and encrypted messages sent by British special forces, turned every village, every turn, and every track into traps. Railway lines were mined. Rails were removed to the millimeter. Supply stations were set on fire before the arrival of troops. Trucks carrying ammunition were destroyed by well-aimed shots from forests that seemed empty. It was an invisible war, where the adversary did not wear a uniform and hid among civilians, and the Germans, accustomed to crushing regular armies, did not know how to react. At the same time, in the air, Operation Strangle, executed by Allied aviation, fulfilled its function with surgical precision. The mission was simple: to prevent any logistical flow from the French countryside to Normandy. To do this, aviation systematically bombed railroads, depots, marshalling stations, and road crossings. Between June 6 and 20, more than 12,000 sorties by medium and heavy bombers were directed not against troops, but against rails. It was the destruction of mobility as a strategic weapon, and it worked. Divisions that were supposed to reinforce the front line were stuck for weeks. Armored vehicles, separated from their maintenance units, broke down. Infantry troops marched for days only to find roads closed and orders already obsolete. In a report intercepted by Allied intelligence, a German commander complained, "We waste more time on maps than on fighting." The phrase captured the Wehrmacht's operational tragedy on the Western Front. the impossibility of reaching the battlefield before it had already been lost. For an army that mastered the art of initiative, the greatest enemy now was time, and he was on the side of the Allies. Meanwhile, on the American side, logistics continued to operate like an industrial clock. Every 24 hours, more than 15,000 tons of supplies were unloaded. This included ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, tents, medicines, and even newspapers. The Allied front was so overstocked that in many sectors soldiers were given hot ration, chocolate, and cigarettes while still exchanging fire with German positions. War had been transformed into a system, and a system requires flow. The Allies dominated this flow. Germany, for its part, was trying to cross a concrete river with its feet shackled. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Since 1940, military analysts have known that modern warfare would not be won by maneuvers alone, but by logistics at scale. But German doctrine, heir to the Prussian thought of the 19th century, continued to be centered on the idea of the genius general, of the decisive movement, of the lightning blow. By 1944, these ideas collided with a reality where every part was mass-produced, every soldier was a number on a spreadsheet, and every decision was built into a supply system. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts that shaped the war, like and subscribe. The support of those who value the story is what allows this content to continue to exist. And while the Germans calculated miles and days to try to react, the Allies advanced meters per hour, but with a flow that never stopped. War had ceased to be a competition between strategies and had become a dispute between supply chains, and Germany was struggling with the line cut. In the next part, we'll look at how even the weather seemed to be on the side of Allied engineering. During the days following the landing, a storm destroyed part of the infrastructure but did not break the system. The Germans would once again see the difference between improvising and preparing for anything. Michael Wittmann was the perfect portrait of what the Nazi regime wanted to sell to its people. A modern, fearless, precise, deadly steel knight. On June 13, 1944, just a week after D-Day, Wittmann and his dreaded Tiger Wang surprised a British column at Villers-Bocage. Within minutes, it destroyed 14 tanks, several armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks. The Wehrmacht celebrated. The propaganda exploded. Newspapers called it the Steel Wall of Normandy. To the German mind, nourished by a decade's doctrine of tactical superiority, this was proof that the war could still be won by individual bravery and the quality of the German machine. But while Wittmann's name was cheered on radios and serials, the real numbers of the war did not stop. The British tank factory produced 500 units per month. The American, more than 1,000. In less than a week, the armored vehicles destroyed by Wittmann had been replaced with leftovers. His Tiger, on the other hand, consumed more than 800 liters of fuel per 100 kilometer, and there was less and less fuel. The difference was not only in scale, but in philosophy. For the Allies, tanks such as the M4 Sherman were planned to be manufactured, repaired, and replaced quickly. It was a mass production weapon. They were simple, standardized, easy to maintain. German heavy tanks such as the Tiger I were works of detailed engineering, expensive, complex, and with a limited number of spare parts. When one Sherman was destroyed, within hours another would land. When a Tiger was damaged, it took days, sometimes weeks into repair, when transport was not possible at all. Wittmann could win tactical battles, but it was fighting against an industrial treadmill, and not just on the front line. The Allied system was structured to absorb losses and keep pace. Mobile workshops were set up a few kilometers from the fighting. Maintenance units accompanied each armored division with spare parts, trained mechanics, and prefabricated structures. A tank that lost its wake in combat was towed, repaired, and returned within 48 hours. The Germans, on the other hand, saw their battered armor being abandoned or destroyed so as not to fall into enemy hands. The doctrine that exalted equipment as an instrument of supremacy now clashed with the reality that even the best weaponry loses value without fuel, without parts, without support. Wittmann's case is emblematic for another reason. His action did not alter the strategic course of the battle. Villers-Bocage was temporarily retaken by the Germans, but the Allied advance continued. The supply line remained intact. The artificial ports continued to operate. New divisions were landing. The resistance continued to sabotage tracks. The map did not move. It was heroism reduced to a footnote in the face of the logic of spreadsheets. The war, which in the German mind was still decided by great deeds and superior tactics, had already migrated to numbers, and those numbers weren't on their side. During the month of June, the Allies landed on French soil more than 50,000 vehicles and 850,000 tons of equipment. Of tanks alone, more than 3,000 reached Normandy in 30 days. Germany, under pressure on three fronts, could barely produce 350 tanks a month, and many did not leave the assembly line for lack of steel, rubber, or engines. Wittmann's heroism, real and brutal as it was swallowed up by this equation. One Tiger destroyed 10 Shermans, but the Allies had 100 on the way. It was like emptying an ocean with buckets of silver. Beautiful, but useless. Even so, the regime continued to sell the narrative of the invincible soldier. Nazi propaganda preferred to exalt the lone pilot, the accurate gunner, the fearless commander. But in the silence of the barracks, the officers already knew. The war had slipped out of their hands. General Hans Speidel wrote in his diary, "We fear that we are no longer fighting armies but factories." This finding, although late, was accurate and irreversible. When Wittmann was killed 2 months later in an ambush in Sinto, the real impact was not tactical but symbolic. His death sealed the end of an era, the era when heroes could turn the tide. If the German army represented ingenuity, talent, and tactics, the Allies represented accumulation, supply, and production, and that formula was working. Each tank that arrived brought not only firepower but a clear message: you can fight well, but we can fight forever. And perhaps the most tragic thing about this story is the admiration that many German soldiers have come to harbor, in secret, for the enemy war machine. "They have as much fuel as we want," wrote a sergeant in the 302nd Infantry Division. Maybe this war is no longer about who is braver, but about who has more leftovers. If this phrase surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins, because in the end, courage without supply is only a prelude to surrender. And in the next part, we'll look at how this war spreadsheet crossed the edge of the impossible, how the Allies created one of the most unlikely feats of modern engineering, a floating submarine railroad that carried fuel straight from England to the front tanks. It was the moment when even oil started to have its own path towards victory. Cherbourg was more than a port. It was a symbol. Located at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, this maritime fortress had been transformed by the Nazi occupation machine into one of the logistical pillars for the control of the Atlantic. With reinforced bunkers, heavy artillery, submerged mines, and a garrison of more than 21,000 men, the German command believed that the city would hold out for weeks, perhaps months. General Karl von Schlieben himself, who was in charge of defense, declared in an official letter, "Cherbourg will only fall under our bodies." But this promise, like so many others made by Wehrmacht officers, did not survive the encounter with the new face of war: full-scale logistics. The siege of the city began on June 22, 1944, just 16 days after D-Day. In less than a week, the Americans had fully encircled the peninsula, isolating the German garrison. But it was not a classic siege, with trenches and slow artillery. It was a systematic strangulation. The Allies used aerial reconnaissance to map defensive positions and precision strikes, to disable communications, depots, and internal routes. Every German attempt at maneuver was cut off by coordinated fire. Every promised reinforcement never arrived. By June 26, the Americans were already inside the city. On 27, von Schlieben surrendered. The surrender, however, was not marked by honor or heroic resistance. According to reports from the Allied command itself, the German general was sweaty, exhausted, dirty, and thirsty. His first request was for water. The man who days before had promised to fight to the last bullet was defeated before hunger, before bullet, before steel. It was won over by logistics. Cherbourg, by falling in 5 days, exposed an abyss that was already becoming irrecoverable. The Nazi belief that fighting spirit could compensate for material inferiority had become a farce. The fortress, which was supposed to hold armies, was run over by schedules, spreadsheets, and supply ships. The past, at last, surrendered. The cruel irony was visible. For years, the Germans had transformed each occupied French city into self-sufficient fortresses, designed according to Prussian doctrines dating from the 19th century. But the War of 1944 was no longer about terrain, nor about morale. It was one of supply and flow, and the Allies, within days, began to transform Cherbourg into what they really wanted, a functioning port. Civilian machinery began operating the day after the surrender. Bombs were removed, cranes reactivated, roads rebuilt. In a matter of weeks, the beaches were no longer the main supply channel. The ships now docked at conquered and refurbished docks. It was a technical, pure victory. Without a parade, concrete gave way to the schedule. The symbolic effect was immediate. The fall of Cherbourg echoed not only at the front, but on the radio and in intelligence reports. The German High Command, for the first time, began to discuss not how to react but how to delay. The tone of the documents exchanged between Berlin and the commanders in the West changed. Words like resist, counterattack, and crush were replaced by delay, retreat, hold time. The Wehrmacht no longer expected to win. He hoped to survive. And the psychological impact also reached the soldiers themselves. A diary found in a hastily abandoned post dated June 28 read, "We are waiting for something that does not come," as if everyone knows we lost, but no one dares to say. This was the new reality. The collapse did not come from the front, but from perception. The realization that everything that was taught in the military academies had been swallowed up by something bigger, something colder, the mathematics of production. And if Cherbourg was a tactical collapse, it was also the harbinger of something deeper. The surrender of a general in search of water, surrounded by thousands of demoralized soldiers, signaled the beginning of ideological collapse. The belief in racial superiority, in the invincibility of German engineering, in the ability to control totally, everything collapsed under the rubble of a port city. The machine that claimed to be perfect was now begging for supplies. The War of the Gods, as the Nazi speeches said, was only a clash between organized logistics and blind faith. But the surrender of Cherbourg wasn't the end. It was just confirmation that the Americans weren't just winning. They were replacing myths with systems, pride in efficiency, promises for deliveries. And this would be seen even more clearly in the next operation, because the Allies didn't just want to land, they wanted to fuel the war with the most valuable and vulnerable input, fuel. And for that, they would create a feat that would unite naval engineering, pressure calculation, and strategic improvisation. In the next chapter, we will see the birth of an invisible monster, the undersea pipeline that crossed the English Channel to feed Allied tanks straight from the French coast. It was the time when even oil gained its own trenches. Heinrich Soe survived D-Day. He was in WN-62, the deadlock point that killed the most Americans in Omaha, and saw his machine gun literally melt from the heat. When he wrote his memoirs years later, he did not talk about victories or honor. He talked about noise, smoke, and futility. He said he shot until his hands burned, and even then the Americans kept coming. It wasn't a battle. It was a process of substitution. Friedrich von der Heide, a colonel in the paratroopers, also survived. He was an aristocrat strategist trained in philosophy. He fought in Normandy, resisted occupation, and spent years analyzing the failure of the Wehrmacht. In an interview in the 1960s, he summarized, "The war we trained to fight no longer existed. The Allies turned the conflict into an industrial operation. Our mistake was not seeing that." Hans von Luck, another veteran armored commander, had direct experience with the mismatch between capacity and reality. When he received orders to contain the Allied advance, he discovered that his battalion had more flat tires than ammunition. In his memoirs, he stated, "We lost the war long before the defeat. We lost the moment we underestimated what we couldn't make." These three names, each with its rank, its origin, and its rhetoric, point to a truth that not even German propaganda could suppress. The defeat was not only military, it was moral. There was no cowardice in the trenches. There was no incompetence in the bunkers. There was rather a mistaken belief, almost religious, in tactical superiority and willpower as supreme weapons. And it was exactly this faith that collapsed. Because the Allies not only had more tanks, more ships, more planes, they had more paths, more margins of error, more engineers than generals, more adaptation than pride. And this, over time, proved invincible. Heinrich's account is especially symbolic. When asked by a French journalist decades later if he felt regret, he replied with a long silence. Then he said, "What I feel is uselessness. I shot men who died for something greater, and they didn't even know it. We, on this side, knew exactly what we were defending, and deep down we already knew it was indefensible. The phrase shocked part of the veteran community, but she was not isolated. Several soldiers captured during and after D-Day said that the feeling of fighting an avalanche against an ocean that did not stop advancing was recurrent, and that bravery turned into fatigue, courage in calculation, resistance in statistics. Von der Heide even wrote that Germany, even if it had won D-Day, would not have won the war, because logic was on the other side, and logic wins over passion. It's a cruel sentence, especially for a generation raised to believe in the power of the fighting spirit. But it is, at the same time, the essence of the Nazi defeat. The Wehrmacht was tactically brilliant, but tactics without refueling are adornments. Strategy without production is an illusion, and bravery without logistics is just sacrifice. An internal British intelligence report, compiled from interviews with German prisoners, indicated that the most repeated word to describe the Americans was not brave or strong. It was infinite. One of the interrogators said, "They have soldiers on the ground, in the air, at sea, in the sky, and behind all this, there are factories." This feeling of fighting against a structure that did not tire, did not stop, did not empty, corroded German morale like acid. The defeat did not come from a formal surrender. It came when the soldiers' eyes realized they were alone, that every promised reinforcement was a mirage, and that each casualty was irrecoverable. Hans von Luck, in his memoirs, recounts a revealing episode. During a displacement in July 1944, he saw for the first time a captured Allied convoy. Trucks, jeeps, light tanks, supply boxes. Everything labeled, stacked, routine. "It looked like a company," he wrote, "an enterprise of destroying things." And he continued, "While we struggled with what was left, they moved forward with what was already separated by destination, date, and sector. The war had been organized, and organization on that scale was the ultimate weapon. If you've made it this far, you may have already understood what these veterans understood too late. That courage without structure is just noise. That pride without adaptation is just memory. And that they were not defeated because they fought badly. They were defeated because the world had changed, and they continued to believe in the war of the past. And it is exactly this change that we will see in the next and final chapter. Because even after the surrender, even after the occupation, a mystery hung over the wreckage of Normandy. How did the Allies manage to move so much, so fast, with such precision? The answer, revealed years later, lay in a secret underground, almost invisible logistics system, but which transported millions of liters of fuel straight from England under the sea. It was Pluto, and it wasn't just a pipeline, it was the victory tube. The German defeat in Normandy didn't happen in a single day. It was built on years of doctrinal arrogance, of faith in a racial superiority that ignored spreadsheets, sheds, and ships. When Hitler's soldiers looked out over the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, what they saw was not a fleet, but a sentence, the sentence that they had underestimated what could not be bravely defeated. The collapse was not just military, it was moral. The Blitzkrieg, which had once swallowed nations in days, became irrelevant in the face of an enemy that did not attack with speed, but with constancy. Tanks that did not stop, food that was never lacking, orders that always arrived. While the Wehrmacht divisions marched slowly, the Allies had already replaced their trucks, updated their maps, and deployed another wave of soldiers. The war that Germany prepared was no longer the war that was being fought. The lesson is hard, but unavoidable. Logistics defines strategy. An army without fuel is just an idea. A troop without communication is just a surrounded group. And courage without replacement is just a beautiful gesture in the face of statistics. World War II taught that volume trumps virtuosity, that scale swallows precision, and that in the modern age victory is a product, assembled, packaged, and delivered in a straight line. As General Alfred Jodl said after the surrender, in a tone of bitter lucidity, "We were defeated by trucks." If you value this type of analysis, this deep research, and this search for the truth behind the propaganda, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel now. This helps to keep the real story alive. Comment below, what was the most shocking data for you in this report? And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.